General Ramona Spears had honestly not thought first contact would go like this. A small, arboreal creature with a long neck and so many prehensile tails, it looked like it was staring at Ramona through a veil of leaves, clicked and chuffed at her. Its visage was currently displayed on a screen taking up most of the wall in the command center. It was maybe making demands, possibly spouting ideology, or even just having some sort of panic attack. Is it rocking on something? There was some kind of metal bar above it that it was swinging back and forth slowly on, so they know how to instantly target and gain access to the most important communication station on Earth, but not how to talk to us. Ramona looked around, pursing her lips. The majority of Earth's leaders, military and political, had set up shop at Outward Station. It was the world's largest communication relay, pointed spaceward. It hadn't gotten a signal in its entire 30 years of operation. Not until today. Not until they were just about to head out to the stars themselves. Then these things showed up. A chorus of opinions and possibly xenophobic statements overtook the room like it was a mess hall at dinner. Ramona started talking to the linguists and scientists instead, with some of the less honorary world leaders cutting in to talk about the future of mankind and work through an existential crisis or two. They didn't get very far. The alien on screen rocked very fast all of a sudden, then made an ear-splitting screeching noise. Ramona was pretty sure she would have just started bleeding from the ears if it had been in person. Did it just hang up on us? Ramona didn't see who spoke. She did, however, see the feed switch to a spacebound object. A massive, sleek starship was approaching Earth. It looked to be at least half as big as one of mankind's best capital cities. A series of long panels opened up in its sides. The vessel was shaped like a great cone. It began to glow, collecting dim energy of some kind that brightened at the tips, like someone was turning up the heat far too much. Everyone went quiet. Ramona had not needed to volunteer. She was, in fact, told multiple times she could direct the mission more than adequately from the ground. The scientist had backed her up when she'd told the leaders of the world that this mission would best be executed with key figures leading it in person. There was no telling how communications would or would not break down once they had breached the vessel. It was practically a suicide mission. The amount of energy gathering in the alien craft's weapon systems was immense. They could be cooked alive just trying to get inside. The plan had been simple. They would use the space-ready fleet they'd been about to launch, with a general for each of several divisions trained in orbital combat, to infiltrate the vessel through the far end of the weapon ports where the least energy was gathered. They'd just have to pray they could find their way to whatever hub served as leadership or critical infrastructure before the firing process was complete. The launch took hours of nerve-wracking mundanity. Ramona had never been so tense during the prep portion of a mission before. They flew past old war-torn space stations, acting as humanity's hope and once-in-a-lifetime true universal front. The flight itself took days. They reached the craft without issue. They were not fired upon. Ramona was mystified. They began entering the vessel. Her own ship, the Future Eye Bright, navigated the massive craft's hull, with the only interruption being snatches of garbled signal and video that flashed across the bridge screen with little coherence. She saw great white rooms filled with machines, countless orderly rows of oddly shaped beds, and the aliens themselves running around and clambering and hanging off things. Turrets raised at several points. At least, what was assumed to be turrets. They didn't fire a single shot. In fact, Ramona saw a dozen different times a turret raise, then lower, then raise. One had gone so fast doing it that something failed and it got stuck. Some piece of large debris went past as something got dislodged somehow. None of the human ships fired. At worst, it was some obtuse trap. At best, it was a waste of ammo. Ramona did her diligence. She dramatically deployed hundreds of human soldiers, internally struggling with the fact she'd be sending good men and women to die when they should have been off to the stars and a bright horizon. They moved through environments containing complex, esoteric alien machinery, always hearing things skittering in the background, listening to whirs and beeps and steaming for almost a full day. The scientists and engineers who'd been dragged along saw the most action. At first, hordes of cubic, tendril-flailing bots prowled towards them, seeming armed, but behaving more like anxious passers-by in a village watching weird outsiders wander into their jungle who they couldn't do anything about. Alert never dropped, but it stopped feeling so sweat and dread-inducing after the first 12 hours. They camped in the vessel without so much as a random warning shot their way. The decision to halt was made purely from severe fatigue. There was something in the air that put lead in the limbs despite any filtration and hazard gear they'd brought. When they finally reached the very center, the command hub, the place where the whole ordeal had truly started, the aliens finally called the machines everyone had started calling servitors to their side. Everything in the room that wasn't man-made or man-recognizable just stood and stared. After a tense few minutes, dialogue was attempted. It went nowhere. Ramona grew frustrated. Apparently, the aliens sensed that. Some started clambering all over railings, steps, bars, and mini-gymnasium structures littering the expansive chamber. She watched them for a while, unsure what to do. She was about to give the order to open fire with no other clear means of progression. Then she saw it. There was a cave painting-style image done up in bioluminescent chalk on one of the walls. She realized just how dark it was. She got a hunch. She hailed the head engineer of her division. Leland. She didn't bother with rank and formality. Do you think we can get some light in here? They'd brought heavy-duty combat drones with them. Some of them broke into brightness, shining floodlight beams across the room. The paintings were everywhere. Now that it was bright and Ramona knew where to look, she saw them in every corner, every crevice, on the floor, and even on some of the alien drones. They showed a taller creature that looked a lot like the wide-eyed small ones currently crowding around the room, occasionally making noise fruitlessly in the direction of humanity's best. The taller figures had their tails around or entwining the bodies and limbs of the smaller ones. "Ramona!" Leland hailed over comm. Ramona was almost too stunned to respond. "You've got my ears. Those aren't weapons. Excuse me? They're massive heat and radiation vents. Ma'am, I've been organizing mapping progress results from the other teams and comparing. I've noticed a lot of the structures seem highly dilapidated. I don't think anything here, anything combat usable at least, has fully functioned for decades, if not longer." Ramona was silent for a while. "Ma'am?" Ramona ordered a blanket stand down. She watched one of the aliens rock on the bars, hanging close to the ceiling. It crouched and made itself small, retreating into the only corner of darkness left in the room. It was the same one, as far as she could tell, that had hailed them. She remembered her kids. She remembered praying to God she'd come back to them covered in medals instead of in a casket. She pictured Carson on the monkey bars on the merry-go-round. Thought of how he'd sometimes hang onto the metal rods like they were a safety blanket when he got anxious or upset. "Can we reach outward?" Ramona whispered, with a delay, but yes. He'd needed to stay on the last gentle grasp. Ramona watched the supply ship slowly descend towards the city of Farsight. Humanity has gotten better with shipbuilding. A careful study of the alien. Ship's anatomy hadn't brought many revelations yet. Lots of what were presumably media archives had worn out and become mostly unintelligible, even accounting for how strangely the aliens already communicated. That was to say nothing of the vast volumes of security machines, medical devices, and life support. The supply ship let loose some of its shuttles, shedding weight and preparing to touch down. One of the shuttles came towards Ramona where she waited on a bench at a safe, shielded distance from the landing area in Earth's first true starport. The boxy shuttle tentatively tested the ground with its support stands before letting them collapse, admitting it had come home. The side-facing ramp opened. A small creature walked out. It only went up to Ramona's chest if they stood side by side. It moved its little body over to her, clad in a bulky safety suit it obviously felt uncomfortable wearing. It wasn't perfect. They'd only partially restored the alien vessel's communications hub. The best they had for now was a little walkie-talkie connected to that great conical structure now hanging in orbit in Earth's quiet blue sky. The alien child made a noise into the blocky communicator. There was a delay. "Mother?" Convincing the leaders of Earth not to blast valuable alien relics and actual children out of the sky had been the easy part. Getting them to set up a highly specialized adoption process had been almost as soul-crushing and complicated as her worst day on the battlefield. Ramona put out her hand and smiled, hoping it came across as friendly. Her third child took her hand. It wasn't going to be any easier than the first 2 times, but it would be worth it. Enjoy another amazing story. If you believe the United Nations government, what happened on May 8, 2219, was a tragedy, lessened only by the immense bravery of the crews involved. If you believe most analysts, what happened was a confused mess that killed hundreds or thousands of humans, Trilaxians, and various other species for no good reason. And if you believe most sailors in the United Nations Australia Force, what happened was one of the greatest victories in the history of the branch. It is not unusual for details of a battle to become obscured, of course. Even things as long passed into the historical record and obsessed about as Waterloo, Stalingrad, or Chicago will forevermore have a shroud of mystery surrounding at least some aspect. What was passing through a commander's mind? How many were involved in a specific action, whether this or that move was more consequential to the overall outcome? But the whole incident, as the events of that day have come to be known, is completely hidden from anywhere approaching a full understanding. What is certain, through public record, are a few key details. The United Nations Postal Service vessel, Cher Ami, was scheduled to enter the star system of Koto in order to deliver new communications equipment to a few scattered scientific outposts and automated stations, and of course, deliver some mail. As this system sat directly beside the line, the vague border between the Geneva Pact and the League of Belorf, the Cher Ami would be escorted by the Red Cliffs-class battleship UNV Hull and the twin Guterres class destroyers UNV I'm Getting Buried in the Morning and UNV Delta P, with said ships conducting routine patrols alongside their escort duty. In other words, a perfectly normal occurrence that had happened thousands of times without incident. On the other side, it is certain that a fleet action group of the League of Belorf was present in the area at the time, officially conducting a freedom of navigation exercise as part of the League's ongoing campaign to demonstrate control over its claimed area. This campaign was of particular political importance, given the League was experiencing growing internal strife over a sense of stagnation and economic slowdown. The United Nations had not yet become embroiled in the Rigel campaign, and fears were increasing inside the League that they no longer could reliably hold back a Geneva Pact offensive if a war were to break out. Thus, the exercise was meant to serve as a reminder to the Pact that the League remained committed to defending its territory no matter what. To this end, the Fleet Action Group consisted of 2 Type 798C battleships, 6 Type 824A cruisers, and 3 824Bs, and 11 Type 376L destroyers. Hardly a premier task force, even the newest vessels in the form of the 376L were a generation behind the bleeding edge of the League. But certainly a meaningful force, or else it would not be in the field. Other noteworthy information is that a month earlier, Sirius Initiative operatives discovered the world known to the United Nations as Renhai, inhabited by a thin sliver of pre-FTL humanoids desperately clinging onto life amidst the ruins of their civilization. The details of this discovery are best related elsewhere, but for the purposes of discussing the Hull incident, it is worth acknowledging a few basic facts. First contact with Renhai was accelerated due to the dire circumstances of its inhabitants, resulting in the diversion of the Carlson-class carrier, UNV Juan Santa Maria, from scheduled exercises to provide aid. This sudden redeployment was communicated to the League, given Renhai's proximity to the line, but given the urgency with which it occurred, the warning was not fully disseminated by the time the Juan Santa Maria was spotted in the area. Given a Carlson class can single-handedly launch and win an invasion of the kind of worlds found around the line, it was no surprise that low and mid-level commanders in the League of Belorf, who had not yet been informed of the Juan Santa Maria's purpose, interpreted its deployment as a possible prelude to a surprise offensive by the United Nations. As a result, League crews were on edge, the lower levels of fleet comm gripped with a paranoia their commanders did not share or even quite understand. Exercises had been lengthened, toughened, turned into farces that pushed exhausted crews and vessels beyond any reasonable point. The upcoming Confederation Day celebrations also increased the strain, with the Fleet Action Group having been held. back from deploying in order to receive a shipment of dress uniforms. This stress, it is believed, contributed to whatever was to come. It was also entirely missed by Geneva Pact intelligence, or if it did, no warning of a potentially volatile situation was communicated to local commanders. Finally, the aftermath. This is the most clear portion, and where all of the theorizing derives from. Within 36 hours of the UNV hull and its escorts entering the system of Koto, 1 Type 798C, 3 Type 824A, 1 Type 824B, and 6 Type 376Ls were destroyed outright. The other 798C, 2 824As and a B, and 3 376Ls were abandoned due to critical damage, and the remainder limped back to base with various degrees of mauling applied. A few hundred crew members of some of these destroyed ships were later returned to the League by the United Nations, along with a larger quantity of bodies. Fleets across the United Nations were placed on heightened alert, and the battleship UNV Tergalax surged into Koto with a full wartime accompaniment. Leaving the system was the UNV hull, near mortally wounded and dry on weapons, and the buried. Under tow. The Delta P had appeared in an adjacent system, alongside the UNPS Cher Ami, broadcasting heavily encrypted transmissions at full power. All UN ships were directed to the Loki anchorage, under heavy guard for repairs and debriefing. The buried was soon scrapped due to damage, while the hull was eventually repaired for service at the Titan shipyard service, which it continues to this day, past all other ships of the Red Cliffs class. Within a week, a new incident occurred in which a Republic of Idarak's task force breached the line in force, pushing Understrength League forces to withdraw from the strategic system of Norat without firing a shot. Tensions rose dramatically. The systems around the line became a sudden hive of military activity, before public negotiations quietened the matter, and the system ended up in Republic hands, subsequently transferred to United Nations authority. This incident quickly grabbed all attention that had previously been directed towards the hull and whatever had transpired there, and so the ship and its crew were allowed to slip back into obscurity. Third-party investigators entering the system once tensions had died down and Koto was no longer crawling with warships, found only a fraction of the expected debris, most of the major chunks having been cleaned up. According to the League, what transpired on that day was that a mutinous Fleet Action Group commander led his forces in an attempt to attack the United Nations, only to blunder into a minefield, then subsequently be engaged and defeated by a loyalist force. Meanwhile, the United Nations maintains that the hull and its escorts blundered into a United Nations minefield whose IFFs had malfunctioned, resulting in significant damage and loss of life. Delta P and the Cher Ami, which were unharmed by the minefield, simply executed the sensible option of exiting the danger zone entirely in order to broadcast for emergency help. Much of its armaments were used in clearing the minefield, or disposed of to minimize the amount of mass for its wounded engines to haul. The crews, both alive and deceased, were bestowed with many medals for their bravery in saving their stricken ships, and generous payouts given to the families of the latter. Neither side has ever even slightly challenged the claims made by the other, leaving the official narrative of events to simply be an amalgamation of the two. Unsurprisingly, this has not satiated many conspiracy theorists nor rational analysts. The Hull incident has become the stuff of myth and legend, 1,001 different retellings from 1,000 different sources. It is not hard to find someone in the United Nations Navy who professes to have the scoop on what went down, from a colleague supposedly on the Tergalax task force, or to have a friend whose uncle's brother-in-law's daughter's girlfriend's dad had been part of the investigation, or something to that effect. Constructing a credible timeline has been rendered impossible, partially due to the lack of information, partially by the natural process of bullshit generation, and partially by active efforts by the United Nations Office of Special Investigations to seed the information space with bullshit. Even the term is impossible to research with an internet search of Hull incident or Hull incident ship, simply providing a curiously high number of resources about something to do with Russian ships and trawlers a few hundred years ago. It is safe to say that the Hull incident is so broadly poisoned a topic as to make it impossible to ever divine the truth of what happened that day, short of a sudden release of archives by the United Nations military. With that said, there are Two leading alternative theories for the events in Koto that are currently accepted by those analysts and academics willing to touch the topic. But in order to explain them, some background is necessary on the vessel and people at its center. The UNV Hull had been named for the Battle of Hull, the first battle fought by the United Nations Command against the Haitian Stellar Imperium in 2021, and the first engagement of the liberation of Britain. Like all Redcliffe's class, and especially the Flight 2 variants of the class, it was a ugly bastard, an ice cream cone mounted to a drink can, to quote one United Nations admiral. To quote a different admiral, responsible for advocating, its procurement, it was near 2,000 meters of get the fuck out my way. Filled to the brim with high-grade lasers, ultra-relativistic electron beams, and missiles of all different shapes and sizes, the hull was built as a long-range dueler that could tear fleets apart, especially when provided with its full complement of drone support ships, and even more so as the centerpiece of a fleet. Despite its undeniable presence on a battlefield and such a prestigious name, the hull was the target of significant mockery throughout its career, much like its two predecessors, of the same name precisely for said name. The reason was obvious, as it lended itself rather easily to obvious jokes about ship's hull versus the ship hull. Despite this, it had a relatively good career prior to the incident, though largely devoid of combat, and was well rated in assessments. It has been speculated that, whatever events transpired on that day in 2219, the crew saw it as a chance to finally rid themselves of the mockery attached to their name and prove themselves. Whether this may have contributed to what occurred, it is safe to say the UNV hull is no longer spoken of in such manner amongst other crews, and that crew members never find themselves short of their drink of choice wherever they go, partially, in an attempt to loosen lips, admittedly. Finally, the commanders involved. In charge of the UNV hull was Captain Jung, a mild-mannered woman by all pre-incident accounts. Post-incident, she was shuffled to Army liaison duties, in what some suspect to be a punishment brief for some factional drama within the Navy, but has since made a return as an admiral who has served the United Nations extremely well. Her nickname, of Kill Something Jung, has never been adequately explained in official sources, and no evidence can be found of pre-incident usage. Meanwhile, information on the League commander has been extremely hard to come by, but what little bits have been gathered suggest he was somewhat of a hardliner and likely part of the aforementioned war hysteria gripping the lower rungs of the League. Badly sourced reports indicate his career had hit somewhat of a dead end, and that his staff were hardly top-notch on the best of days, with high turnover and a terrible working environment even before the stress of the pre-incident days. Whatever transpired that day, it is certain that this man was poorly equipped to deal with it. Now we must address the two most prominent narratives. As we shall see, both have strengths and weaknesses that make them more or less easy to believe. 3. First is rather straightforward and is generally the more popular one amongst analysts. It argues that the incident started with a major navigational error conducted by the League forces, due in part to the high stress affecting the crews and, in part due to poor quality staff. In particular, the deputy commander of the task force is reported to have been extremely underqualified, with an alleged leaked intelligence report produced for the United Nations Astral Force describing him as a failson. According to this narrative, the error led the Fleet Action Group to exit hyperspace in the Koto system rather than its intended destination. The error was quickly recognized, but the commander, whose flagship was one of the two Type 798Cs, made a strange call. Since the line is hardly a legally defined border, but rather a representation of active control, his task force was, as far as he was concerned, in fact perfectly within their rights to maneuver through the Koto system, so long as their weapons were unloaded and intentions clearly broadcasted. In this strange interpretation of escalation management, the United Nations would be forced to be on the back foot, and would either have to quietly acquiesce to the transit or resort to firing warning shots and threaten to escalate first, either of which presented propaganda value. And, of course, propaganda value meant career value. Indeed, so the narrative goes, the task force initially faced no serious problems maneuvering through the Koto system, given its limited number of inhabitants. However, the hull's discovery of their presence complicated things, as the hull refused to simply acquiesce to their demands for easy traversal. Soon, the two sides were on approach to one another, and a confrontation began. As the two sides argued about who was permitted to do what, and before Captain Jung could draft and send an initial report to advise her commanders on the situation, the League task force drifted into the path of an immense, free-drifting United Nations minefield. Lacking in the correct IFFs to evade attack, their sensors and defenses being tuned down to avoid actively provoking the United Nations fleet, the commander assessing that they had enough provocations already for his purposes, a mine triggered in the vicinity of a Type 824A and crippled it in a single blow. Unsurprisingly, this was enough to throw the confused League task force into a panic and convince them they were under active attack. Reactors were surged to full wartime emergency power, shields and defensive weapons brought up, and barrages of missiles fired off to clear the minefield. And of course, missiles were fired towards the UNV hull and its accompanying ships. Captain Jung, recognizing a crisis, ordered the Cher Ami to flee, dispatching one of her two destroyers to ensure its safety from any potential pursuers, and to broadcast a warning message to attract reinforcements. Jung decided to take on the task force with one battleship and a single destroyer, in the hopes of buying time for this civilian escape, and to hold back what was potentially the first wave of a League incursion into United Nations territory. From here, the narrative often splits into competing versions of events, before reunifying into one singular outcome. These different versions are, ultimately, simply assigning blame for the damage in different ways. Some argue that the hull and buried focused on largely defensive efforts, with the damage dealt to the League forces being by and large the result of the minefield they had become trapped in the middle of. Others argue that the League largely cleared the minefield, suffering additional casualties from it, but that the incident was characterized by a long-range artillery and missile duel, the hull largely keeping range and dealing damage, while the buried played goalkeeper and tossed the occasional salvo out. And some argue for a hybrid of these explanations. Eventually, these converge on a singular accepted truth, that by the time a withdrawal was ordered, the damage had been done. To either side, but the United Nations had ultimately come out better on the balance sheet. League Fleet Comm subsequently declared the task force mutinous, a court-martial sentencing the commander to death in order to make clear to the United Nations that this was a rogue act, while a compelling narrative and having some useful evidence. To support it, this story has fallen short in some areas. For example, the minefield is a rather improbable cause of escalation. No mention of free-drifting minefields in the Kodo system was made by the scientific crews previously assigned to the system, despite such a thing obviously posing a major navigational hazard. The coincidence of it bumping into the League task force at the most critical time possible is also astronomically unlikely. Furthermore, even assuming this to be the case, even the most hardline and stressed League naval commander should have had the presence of mind to recognize he was not under attack from the hull, since at the range involved, any attack would obviously have been seen coming. Other problems are obvious. Hyperspace navigation, by its nature, should not allow for these kinds of errors, no matter how stressed the crew may be. The jump should be automatically computed, with no room for errors like this short of intentional orders. And the sheer scale of the damage inflicted does not conform with the different accounts. For the League to have been so mauled in the mine-heavy version, the minefield would have had to be ridiculously dense, while also ignoring the question of how both United Nations vessels became so heavily damaged. The alternative narrative, of it being a duel with the hull and buried, has a more debatable problem. That the Cher Ami was scrapped by the UNPS within months, due to it reportedly being too expensive to maintain. While the vessel was certainly on the older side as a Yakatakutli class, vessels of the same class would be in service for decades to come. It is impossible to say what exactly happened, but it is extremely likely the Cher Ami took some degree of damage that rendered the ship not worth the cost of repair instead of replacement. If this was the case, it firmly debunks the idea of a long-range duel, since the Cher Ami should not have taken any fire before it escaped. Putting this aside, the Cher Ami would not in reality have required a destroyer escort if this was simply a misunderstanding, since no pursuit was likely, and Captain Jung should have retained the Delta P for her own defense. Finally, both variants fail to explain the sheer degree of carnage inflicted. 18 ships on the League side were destroyed or abandoned, and the United Nations saw hundreds of its crews killed, a modern cutting-edge destroyer left a wreck, and a battleship extremely heavily mauled. For some sort of long-range duel from an accident to have done this beggars belief. Thus, a different narrative is increasingly taking precedence in explanations of what happened that day. In this version, rather than a comedy of errors that resulted in an exchange of fire and a withdrawal, the hull incident was something far more sinister. Proponents note the well-accepted fact that the presence of the Juan Santa Maria put local League commanders on edge, and that a local clique of hardliners believed that it was a genuine prelude to war. They continue this line of thinking, arguing that rather than causing vague stress that resulted in errors, the hardliners decided to take action, intentionally provoking a confrontation in order to preempt an attack and demonstrate League superiority. Furthermore, this victory, it was presumed, would provide them and their allies more influence in the League's decision-making. Hence, the story goes, a plan was hatched. The likely hyperspace exit point had already been identified, and so the League task force was positioned nearby, this close range giving minimal time for the UN vessels to react. If any survived the initial barrage, which was not expected, they would have to flee with their engines facing the League, thus leaving many weapons unavailable. If they fled through hyperdrives, the League could simply ride the hyperspace wake and knock them back into reality. The hypercomms relay was also destroyed, eliminating the chance of the token presence in system providing early warning and stopping the hull from calling for reinforcements in combat. The United Nations and the galaxy at large would find out what had happened at Koto only when it was firmly in League hands. Thus, Captain Jung found her ship suddenly under all-out attack from behind, despite having no prior warning and lacking the wartime complement of support vessels. Of course, all would have been in a ready condition, as was protocol when exiting hyperspace, but there would be a serious psychological impact on the crews to find missiles screaming in towards them as they exited hyperspace, lasers starting to pound against their shields. The hull, the buried, the Delta P, and the Cher Ami found themselves ambushed by a numerically superior enemy, well prepared and spoiling for a fight. It should, by all reasonable predictions, have been a massacre, impossible to survive. And yet, in those brief moments, Captain Jung did the impossible. The hull flipped on axis, staring down its attackers, and let loose with every weapon system. The void around it became a boiling mass of missiles and lasers and particle beams, the full fury of a United Nations vessel at war. Its dusty plasma radiators glowed red-hot with the anger of 1,000 suns, perhaps one of many signs to the League crews that they had made a dramatic error. What ships fell first could never be known, but the ferocity with which it lashed out would have quickly added up. Jammers were flung to maximum power, aiming to turn the enemy's numerical superiority into a weakness, cutting off their ability to coordinate. Amidst this, hell poured forth into the vacuum of space the Cher Ami, already heavily damaged from the brutal pounding it had taken in the first few moments of the engagement, and Delta P were ordered away into hyperspace, successfully making it away in spite of their damage. The hull and the buried therefore stood together, firing every weapon in their arsenal. Lasers were unleashed, incoming missiles blinking out of existence in milliseconds as arrays pivoted from target to target faster than any living being could process. The hull's own missiles poured forth, racing towards targets unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the counterstroke. Ultra-relativistic electron beams smacked at targets with immense amounts of energy, boiling away unprotected chunks of armor and evaporating crews with radiation. The buried, crew perhaps seeing the irony in getting to live up to their name, provided what they could to the fray and began to charge their own drive. Not for an escape, no, simply for a better position. The hull, however, was not content to simply find a better position. Instead, the battleship, still spitting fire even as it ailed under the weight of blow after blow, tore a hole in reality first, the buried's captain receiving only 2 words as a message to forewarn of Jung's plan. Guide us. While in hyperspace, Captain Jung gave no grand speech to her crew, made no attempt to justify her intent to keep engaging rather than fleeing. There was no need to, for the crew were already fully set on fighting. Instead, Captain Jung used the brief interlude accelerating the ship once more to gain velocity for when it re-emerged from hyperspace in order to explain her plan. Here, she gained the nickname that has followed her ever since, stating her desire above all to get back into the fight and do the one thing those Trilaxian bastards never could, kill something. The hull spent only 2 minutes in hyperspace, hardly time even for a deep breath. Instead, engines were thrown far past their wartime legal maximum, a burn so potent it would have caused crew members to black out, were it not for acceleration couches and gravity generators. Even with them, it would have been a grueling moment, particularly as limited damage control was attempted. Captain Jung sat in control, guiding the hull along an ever-adjusting course to precisely where she wanted it to be. Then it burst back into reality, its drive plume directly in the path of one of the two Type 798Cs, nose pointed straight at the 798C, acting as the command ship just 1,000 kilometers away. The enemy had, of course, assumed the hull to be fleeing, and were thus charging their drives in anticipation of being able to intercept its hyperspace wake as it passed through their formation. Of course, they were also preoccupied with the missile salvo the hull had released before departing, further clouding their ability to predict what came next. They had not been able to understand why the buried had remained alone in system, desperately, fleeing from them with its conventional drives, and as to why it was broadcasting the exact location of League forces so loudly over radio. Now, as the hull reappeared in their midst as the largest guided missile in human history, every weapon system from CIWS laser to missile to laser artillery to UREB spitting in every direction, its engines alone melting through a battleship, and leaving it crippled, they understood. What exactly happened next is debated by proponents of this narrative. In the conservative view, the League commander saw a battleship bearing down upon him at an ever-growing speed, and with less than a minute before it hit him, decided to get out of dodge. The ship triggered a random jump, using the already spooled updrive with a random vector and coordinates. Unfortunately for him, a combination of the immense damage sustained and the stress of the random jump caused the failure of the hyperdrive, causing a calamitous scattering of a large number of his battleship's constituent atoms across the battlefield. The surviving chunks of the vessel variably flung aimlessly into hyperspace, or left to drift dead in the void. In the more radical view, the hull continued to accelerate towards the panicking 179C, only flipping at the very last moment and unleashing its drive plume as a weapon for the second time that minute. The consequences would be rather obvious. Whatever, the truth, the charge of the hull broke the cohesion of the enemy fleet and ripped away their commander's ability to regain control. Their commander was dead, and his vessel lost. The other battleship was a crippled mess whose crew had effectively given up the fight in favor of desperate damage control, and the fleet at large was in a state of chaos. The surviving ship commanders were now leaderless against an enemy that had decisively gained the initiative. To fix this problem would require a significant ability to improvise, large amounts of tactical acumen, and coordination. None of these were on display that day in the League forces. Even if they were, the hull was putting enough energy into its jammers to blind God, and its weapons would have only added to the carnage reaped upon sensors and communications. The greatest advantage the League now had, their numbers, was now turned into a weakness, each ship commander desperately attempting to coordinate once more and failing. League salvos were fired out of sync, missiles rendered useless by uncoordinated, targeting and jamming by their own countermeasures even before they faced the maelstrom generated by the hull's defenses. Lasers lacked coordination, their aim points spread out across the hull rather than focusing on burrowing through specific segments of armor. Some debris fragments recovered even suggest fratricide by League weapons, though the legitimacy of this debris cannot be fully assessed. For all this trouble, the League forces were not toothless. It was around this point that the buried was left dead in the void, its engines crippled by a nuclear glancing blow from a League salvo that also fatally irradiated up to half its crew. The hull's stunt, while eliminating its largest opponents and regaining the initiative, had put it directly in the range bracket it was least designed for. Surrounded by enemies that still knew how to use their weapons, even if not in the most coordinated way. Every blow it took knocked out weapons, killed damage control crews, battered away at the armor. Any chance of escaping to further range had, if you believe the conservative version of events, been quelled by seeing a live demonstration of what happens to a ship with such damage jumping into hyperspace. It was not so much stand or die as stand and die, but the hull, and its crew had made their peace with that. Every last missile was expended, large nuclear payloads rubbing shoulders with vast swarms of cheap soda can of death KKVs. Particle. Beams continued to fire until they were melted into oblivion, and even then they still attempted to get a few more shots out. Lasers scorched targets and their own coolant systems alike, all sense of safety gone in favor of a few more seconds of fire. It was undeniably, visibly, desperation, as overclocked reactors climbed higher and higher towards catastrophic failure. To all those present, it should have been clear that the hull was ultimately doomed, but at least one League crew thought differently. Amidst this nightmare, a Type 376L activated its already spooled drive, following a course straight out of the battlefield. Its choice to do so would have generated one final brutal morale shock to the remaining crews who had just seen so many of their comrades annihilated. The objective reality that the hull was increasingly crippled and that simply a few more salvos could well have achieved its destruction would be impossible to see in that moment. All they could see was a ship that refused to die, continuing to pummel targets into oblivion. It was no wonder what would come next. Drives were activated, a mad dash away without coordination in mind, only a desire for escape. Jumps were made, ships disappearing as fast as they could, although at least one 376L was unable to enter its portal before a lucky pulsed laser shot from the hull eliminated its drive, stranding it in Koto. Not all vessels could get away, though with the crippled 798C being one of them. Those remaining began broadcasting messages of surrender, and the battlefield fell silent. When, a day later, the UNV Tergalix arrived with a full wartime battle group surrounding it, the crew found their sister ship huddled in close proximity to the buried, rendering what assistance it could spare, though its guns remained trained upon the surrendered League vessels, ready to jump back into the fray as soon as it became necessary. Thankfully, it did not. What followed was a series of hurried and wide-ranging backroom dealings between the League and the Geneva Pact. In these, the necessity of a cover-up was negotiated, the League highly embarrassed both by the defeat, but also by the complete lack of control over their commanders, demonstrated by such an incident. In return for agreeing to cover up such an embarrassment, the United Nations received both guarantees of a far more conservative stance from the League and some other light rewards. The subsequent confrontation at NORAD was in effect merely a highly theatrical gift transfer, one meant to also draw attention away from Koto as the Geneva Pact tore apart the surrendered vessels and attempted what cleanup they could. For those involved, the path was simple: debrief, medals, transfers to quieter work. Captain Jung was shuffled away to the quieter task of liaison work as a reward as soon as she had recovered from wounds occurred whilst participating in post-battle damage control. What occurred for the League crews who made it home is unknown, but it is suspected that many of the senior officers received painful reminders of their obligations regarding illegal orders. The above is, of course, simply another narrative, no matter how flashy it may be. There is very little evidence for it, and certainly many of the claims it makes are rather fantastical. It is no wonder that most who choose to examine the Hull incident settle for the simplicity of the first narrative, in spite of its flaws, because who could possibly believe something so absurd as the second narrative? As I stated earlier, it is impossible to know what narrative is ultimately true. Supposed photos can be, and often are, faked. Alleged crew testimonies can be, and often are, lies. Documents can be, and often are, fabricated. All truth dies in the face of the modern internet and the efforts of the Office of Special Investigations to keep things under control. Perhaps even these competing narratives are themselves official fictions, meant to distract from a real one no one has yet thought to propose. There is certainly much suspicion from proponents of the second narrative towards the first, believing it to be a psychological operation to distract from the truth of the second narrative. Believers of the first often believe the second to be a psyop to discredit their more reasonable explanation. Perhaps both are true at once. There are certainly even more alternative narratives, including fanciful ones about supposed never-before-seen stealth ships duking it out, or some far larger engagement entirely covered up, or that the United Nations invaded NORAD that day and failed. And perhaps even if these are not deliberate fabrications by a government seeking to keep things under wraps, they are emotional fabrications. Stories told because they are more interesting than some boring, plausible reality. Certainly, there is more allure to the idea of a United Nations battleship near ramming a League counterpart as the void of space turns into a hell so potent. Satan himself averts his gaze, than of a tragic tale of ships blundering into minefields amidst navigational error. It is not lost on those who study the Hull incident as a sociological phenomenon that the second narrative has found far more purchase amongst the Astral, a branch that is obviously receptive to a tale of brilliant heroics by its own, but there is one piece of evidence for the second narrative that is impossible to set aside. During a recent home visit, in which the hull was parked in geostationary orbit above its namesake town, the vessel was open to civilian visitors. This is common practice for United Nations vessels, and the crews have gotten well versed in batting away questions they are not permitted to answer. Even for a ship whose past is as mysterious as the hull, these questions are usually posed by unwitting civilians who think they will be able to just ask for the exact specifications of a state-of-the-art missile. Certainly, no one who served that day would ever be permitted such a public-facing role, though the realities of it being several decades ago automatically preclude that, and the repair and subsequent refits have well concealed any signs of possible damage. And yet, a clue remains. In the main canteen of the UNV hull, mounted securely upon a wall, sits a strange piece of armor plate, large enough for 3 people to stand shoulder to shoulder in front of it. To those familiar with their contact war history, or those who have read the plaque, its nature is obvious. Armor salvaged from a Hakaitian IFV, alleged to be the first vehicle destroyed by UN forces during the liberation. Its surface is a mix of impacts from calibers now ancient to us, shrapnel from weapons long since retired, and some crude, faded graffiti left by joyous resistance fighters. The object has a near religious significance to the crew of the hull, as an artifact from such a momentous event obviously would, and so it has been left untouched since installation, except once. On a corner, at the smallest scale any artist could possibly draw by hand, sit 18 marks, noticeably less faded than their authentic contact war predecessors. Simple X's, no attempt at detail. No explanation is provided as to their meaning, and crew members asked about it offer shrugs, claiming the marks have been there since before they were assigned. Author's notes. Not too much to say, except to say this was written entirely since my last story, after someone suggested they would like to know about the mention of the Hull incident. I had no prior plans to do this, so it's a bit thrown together by my standards, but it's probably good to get back to a high turnaround. Even if this was severely hampered by the W key on my laptop no longer working. Now, some probable questions. First, the Guterres class is a reference to the real world, current, UN Secretary General. In universe, we are in 2024 currently in the throes of the interwar period, as the United Nations Command attempts to gather together resources for defeating future Hakaitian assaults against Earth. Hence, in universe, Guterres is seen as the first wartime Secretary General, the man who oversees its transformation into a coordinating military body and sets it on a path to being the supranational entity it eventually becomes. The Red Cliffs class is a reference to the Battle of the Red Cliffs. As for the names of each destroyer, in universe they are supposed to be selected by crews themselves, who propose names and then decide via a vote system. Evidently, a few people on a brand new Guterres class really cared about old YouTube videos about diving hazards. More expensive vessels, such as cruisers and so on, usually have a whole bureaucratic gauntlet to go through before their name is approved. So they tend to get names of historical figures, key battles, and so on. The modern battleship class, the Ain Jalut, features a UNV Taffy 3, for example, and in case someone is wondering what there is as a canonical answer, I'm partial. To the second narrative is true, but the League battleship tried to flee only to have a horrible malfunction. Just my favorite out of the bunch. But there's room for all interpretations. You can choose to believe the first narrative and that the graffiti is simply a crew member who bought into the myth, for example. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this Video a big thumbs up and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.